Okay, there we go. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining me. I'm Jennifer Barnhill. I'm a columnist for military.com and a Navy spouse myself. I just PCS to Maryland, which is why you see various colors of paint and like no light fixtures up here. And I'm sitting with a Amazon box as my desk. It's PCS season, and I know that there's a lot of folks who understand that. But thank you for coming. And just wanted to give you a little background about these conversations. They're used to help, obviously, get together with you guys and just to hear from you about your experiences, but I use them to inform some of the articles that I write about the community. Sometimes the quotes are pulled from the conversation. Sometimes I'll reach out to you after and follow up. And so that's the purpose, because often we meet and sometimes we meet and there's not a direct result that you see out of these conversations, but that I can promise you is that it does inform what I write. And so that is a promise that is honored on my end as best as I can. But I wanted to start off talking about resilience. We have today, if you don't know, Corie Weathers. She is the author, and I have a prop this time, of The Military Culture Shift. And she is an amazing military spouse herself. If you haven't read this book, it really deep dives into many different topics about the military community, but specifically looking at different generations and how different people approach different topics, different issues that they're facing within the community. One of the issues that Corie touches upon in her book, of the many that she does touch upon, is that concept of resilience. And she has the clinical background to back up her opinions. It's more than that. And so we're thrilled to have you join for the second session today. Corie, would you like to give a little introduction of yourself as well as the topic on resilience, and then we'll get started with the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, so much for having me back for a second session. Phenomenal conversation earlier today. And I also just really appreciate the honesty through which you write, and you are an amazing voice for our community. And so I appreciate that. And even before I ever met you, I'd read your articles and I go, yes, we're saying some truthful things and sometimes saying some hard things. And so you did a great job introducing me. I think the only thing that I'll just add to this conversation is I'm also a spouse. We are in Central Texas, so at Fort Hood. I've got two boys, but I'm a clinician by trade. Now I more so travel and teach and consult organizations, sometimes DoD leaders, on understanding the culture. And so I really just took my clinical background and decided to, yes, I still work with families, very similar to this really unique platform that Jennifer has built in order to understand and hear from you guys. I kind of see that a little bit on the clinical side when I'm working with people in sessions. But then I travel around and track some of these trends, and resilience is definitely one of those that I've experienced, but also have seen different trends through different generations and their approach, but also what's shifting in our community. And so I basically have taken that clinical side of me and used it to study the whole culture. So 2 million service members and their families of all branches, and looking at, like, for example, this topic is resilience in the Army in different generations. Is it the same struggle, or is it the same kind of opinions and thoughts as we see in the other branches as well? And how does that compare between, let's say, the Boomer generation and Gen Z generation? And I just find it fascinating how we use words, but sometimes we mean something different and we define those words very different. And so I appreciate this conversation. I think I'll just share, back in 2015 was where this word really jumped for me, after we moved, and then suddenly found out that as soon as we moved, we thought it was going to be a longer move and worth that move, only for them to go, never mind, we're actually just going to move you again in 5 months. And as a family, we were like, oh, we could have, the boys and I could have actually stayed where we were for just a few months and had more stability. And I think that was the moment for me that I was like, I think I just don't want to be resilient anymore. I don't, even if we're supposed to be able to bounce back, I just had this resentment that came up in me at the time that just was starting to question that in my own life, and starting to ask questions about when should I be resilient? What does that mean? What does it mean for us to use that phrase? And then that also, like Jennifer is doing here, triggered me to want to go around and ask the question, what do you guys think about that word? and how do you feel? So thank you for having me, Jennifer. Really looking forward to this conversation. And thank you guys for giving up some of your time in the evening. I appreciate it coming from wherever you are.
Um, so the way the format of this works, if you've never joined, is I put some poll questions in, and then I sit awkwardly and allow you to speak. And I have no problem with that. So one of the things I like to ask in the beginning of these questions, especially on this topic where it's kind of amorphous, it's not like childcare where it's like, I wish there was more childcare. This is a topic that has everyone approaches very specifically and based on their own individual experiences with the word. And so I'd love to hear either someone expand on the poll question that I just asked about their immediate response to the word, or what brought you to this conversation today to talk about this topic. Is there any story that comes to mind that you'd like to share? And again, I have no problem with awkward silences. The best stuff comes after an awkward silence.
I'll start since everybody's being quiet. So I came earlier, but I do my best like responses after thinking. So I came earlier without, just listening mostly. I did share a little bit, but I mostly listened. So first of all, when I first heard the word resilient, I knew the word resilient, but in the military community was when I became a key spouse in like 2016. And I sat in trainings and I was like, yes, why haven't I heard of this? I need this skill. But then as it continued on, it became, kind of dismissive to and almost like taboo to talk about your real feelings or your real experience or especially and like being a key spouse, our job was to help support other spouses. And so in a lot of the trainings I sat in, it was like everything needed to be shiny and happy and perfect. And I began, like, I'm a really honest person. And so I really had a hard time with this, like, inability to be like, you know what, my family's struggling. My kids are struggling. And what does that mean? And, um, you know, uh, just so I don't know. That's why it's painful for me because there was an initial, like, wow, yes, why don't my kids get these trainings? Why don't and then also like, okay, we're still here, it is 2024, and I feel like we're still hitting the same thing. And personally, where I'm a Space Force spouse, and we just had a recent suicide in the community. And so, I'm like, what are we doing? How are we going to change this narrative? And how are we going to best support our people so that we aren't facing this quite so much, especially since this one was a chief. And it just feels like that is a really big deal because everyone wrote like all these amazing things about him online. And so there's just questions that, and so I want to be a part of changing the narrative. And so that was why I showed up to this conversation. So
I appreciate you sharing. And earlier in the conversation, someone kind of alluded to the same connection with resilience and suicide. And I know that there's two levels of this word being used in the community. One is absolutely not trying to minimize or make that there is a connection, right? Clinically, there's definitely a connection in mental health. I'll let the professional talk about that, but I don't want to minimize that connection in the response of like, I hate that word because I do hate that word sometimes when it's used improperly. And I don't want to minimize that. And I almost want to think of it in a different way because and I'll let Corie kind of speak to the differences that she kind of touched upon in the last call. There is the clinical definition of resiliency and resilience as compared to how it's used in this community. And those things are very maybe perceived differently. And so I think when we're talking about the connection to military suicide, I think that we need to have it with a clinical definition in mind as compared to the more casually used PR word. So thank you for sharing, but and you feel free to speak about either in this context. But does anyone else have anything they want to share? Or Corie, did you have anything to add to what I just shared?
No, I think it's an important distinction. And yet it's the same word. And so what does the word mean, right? When you Google it, it says, some ability to bounce back, some ability to, I remember years ago, it looked like it seemed like it returns to its original state. And I remember when I spoke from the stage very boldly in 2015 and told, all these military leaders that I didn't want to be resilient. I think what I actually said is I don't think that I want to bounce back to the original form that I was in before this tough thing that happened. And it just felt like the wrong word. And yet it's what they mean by it is actually the ability. At the time I said, I actually would like to bounce forward. I would like to grow from it. I'd like to become something other because of it. Maybe I don't want to bounce back to anything. And so there's a lot of feelings around it, but to Jennifer's point, it is a healthy coping skill to be resilient. When we are not resilient, then we are not coping. We are not pushing through difficult things. And so I'll just say for me, because I had such a strong reaction to this idea of bouncing back, I adopted Angela Duckworth's grit, which is this ability to push through difficulty for the sake of reaching a long-term goal. And so when your sights are set on this long-term goal and you want it bad enough, you're willing to move through difficulty to reach that goal. And she found that it wasn't necessarily tied to talent or to anything in your upbringing. It really, some of the grittiest people had been through great suffering. But really, I liked that idea. And I saw our community as being gritty because if you're facing a deployment or if your kids are going through a difficult time and you're making the choice to move through it, it's because of something that you're aiming toward, right? So I think just clinically, resilience is important. We don't want to stay stuck. We don't want to drown in the swamp of sadness or in the swamps of despair, to use a Princess Bride quote, but instead to feel like we're moving forward. So then maybe the question isn't so much, is resiliency good or bad? I think it's like Jennifer's asking is, how do we use that word resilience in the community? How do you feel about the word because of it? And like we kind of touched earlier today, is that there's a definition, but it also feels like an expectation. And so kind of sorting out those.
Thank you. Jeremy, do you want to share?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And I appreciated your comments because I fully endorse where you're coming from. Just as a way of background, I come from the EFMP community, a longtime advocate in that space. I remember when this conversation was started in the military kind of world, I was on a panel with a set of spouses who were caregivers for our wounded warriors. And I was a caregiver, obviously, for my younger daughter at the time. And one of the individuals as we were talking and having this conversation about, what this community needed, both, from a caregiving perspective, one of the long since retired individuals from one of the military, support organizations, one of the kind of well-known ones, said something along the lines of, I just really wish we could, 80% of the people are doing just fine in the military. And we have to figure out what is it that those 80% have that the 20% don't have. And I just thought, man, is there something wrong with me? And I said, no. And I've just felt very much like that was some excuse to not fix the problems that we were trying to address. And I've continued to feel that way. I've done, a little bit of, layman's research kind of in the area of, this is considered part of they call it the power of positive thinking kind of background. And there's some real problems with the underlying research and some of what they've discovered about, there's not necessarily a lot of research supporting this, and yet the military services, through a lot of the resilience training assistants, military resilience trainers, et cetera, we've kind of, the services have bought into something that may or may not be evidence-based, which I think is a real problem. Not to say that, to your point, resilience is good, but it's got to be treated in an appropriate manner.
Thank you, Jeremy. I know that came up in the earlier conversation, and it kind of diverged of the idea of that expectation, and the heart potentially, and I don't pretend to speak to the heart of the decision makers who move forward with the resilience model for their programming. But I have not met a military leader or someone in the military who was like maliciously trying to do something that wasn't with a good intention. So I would have to think that was intended for good, but maybe the unintended, not consequence per se, but an unintended issue with that theory is that to be expected to do something and then not have there be a relief period. Corie mentioned in her book, there's ups and downs with ops tempo, and when we're going and we get a relief, that gives us hope that it will get better. We know we can look forward to in the Navy a shore tour or something that gives you that peace. And I think that is where that theory maybe isn't playing out as intended in what's happening right now. And so I would love to hear, as someone, if they're willing to share a little bit about that expectation in the poll question, where do you think that comes from, or where have you heard that expectation shared with you? Is that something that someone is overtly sharing? Is it PR stuff? Where are those messages coming from, if you're willing to share? Heather, I see you unmuted, so I hope you want to share. Oop, I can't hear you for some reason. You're unmuted, but I cannot hear you. Okay. If anyone else wants to share while Heather's figuring that out.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Then Kristen, after Heather, your turn.
Look at that. Somewhere in the PCS hustle and bustle, I lost my webcam and had to buy a new one, and literally plugged it in for the first time today to interview somebody. So we're still just working out the kinks. Okay. Like, I've got boxes behind me, right? Like, I'm being resilient. Look, I'm just doing the thing with the boxes and it's fine. And everything's fine. Over the last, 2024, like 9 years of my husband's career, we've moved Oconus or back 4 times in 8 years, from the Southeast to Alaska. Like, I've crossed the continent, and, from a financial standpoint, like, we're not hurting, but like, we're not getting ahead. It's not doing us any favors moving to or from Oconus 4 times in a row. And we're in the middle of our 3rd move in 3 years. We're slated to move again next year. I can't find a job. My kids are having a difficult time. My 5th grader's going into school 7. My 2nd grader's going into school 4. The dog died. Like, it's just a bad country song. Okay. And it's really, really difficult. And I'm a military kid. So I've been a military groupie for my entire life. I now lead my own band of groupies, and it sucks. And I can't, my kiddo, was going from 2nd to 3rd grade, and it was like November, and we were at a military base, and his last buddy from 2nd grade that was still here was moving after Thanksgiving break. And he was 7. He came home and he just cried and cried and cried. And of course, Daddy was out of town, and he was just devastated that we're not moving this year, and my friend is moving, and he's my last friend, and I said, buddy, I know it's hard. And I said, you have a really big heart, and you were designed this way, and you love big, but you hurt big, and I can't fix that for you. And I know what you're feeling, and I can't fix it. And so, yeah, like, my 7-year-old's building resilience. He also is continuously going through heartbreak. We don't have long friendships. We don't have stability in our community. Whether or not Dad is even home is variable. And so that sense of stability for my family by default, whether I signed up for it intentionally or not, falls on me as the spouse, right? So all of my degrees, all of my training, all of my research goes on hold so that I can make sure that my family is safe and stable and secure, which now puts my mental health at risk, because I love what I do and I love using my brain, but my kids are more important. So there's this very real spiral of what happens with military life and some of these things where it's difficult to afford food and you can't find a house and you can't get the kids in a stable school. And we had to get the MFLAX involved this year for my kiddos. Like my 10-year-old said on a scale of 1 to 10, he was a 3 most days. Like he's 10 and he plays video games and goes and rides his bike, and like he was really struggling. So yeah, we're super resilient, but kind of what Corie said, I don't want to necessarily set back to factory settings. And I told someone, this last 15 months was particularly difficult for our family. And I told a friend back in January, I said, I don't even feel like standing up because I feel like every time I get my feet under me, another wave is going to come. So why would I even stand up? I'm exhausted. I am exhausted from getting back up over and over and over and over. And, you'll talk to counselors sometimes. It's like, yep, got to be positive. Like, let's have the positive thinking. I'm like, I don't want to be positive. And no, I didn't know what I was signing up for because had I read the fine print, I might have made a different decision. And yeah, this is this great marketable skill to who? Nobody's going to hire me because I freaking move all the time. I can't, I can rely on my spouse and we have a great relationship, but we experience the difficulties of military life from different sides of the coin. And so while he can hear me out, he can't empathize. And then, if you talk to career spouses, like, well, then why don't you just get a job if you miss working, if they're not in your same situation, or you talk to stay-at-home spouses and like, but don't you just get joy from like providing for your family? And I think that for me, being told that I'm resilient is sort of this flippant like dismissal of, but you're so good at handling it. And it's like the movie Encanto where she's talking, the one sister is talking about like being so strong, like for the family. And it turns out like it's actually really heavy and it's crushing her. And like, yeah, I am strong and I can handle it, but I don't feel like it and I am exhausted. And so being told that I'm resilient is almost just a reminder of like, man, you sure can shovel a lot of shit. And I'm like, but I don't want to anymore. I just want to have like a season that something doesn't go wrong, that we're not in a house that has roaches, or we're not in a deployment, or my kids aren't floundering. It just, yeah, we can handle a lot, but it's a lot to handle at the same time.
First of all, you're not alone. I know that it feels very lonely, I'm sure. And I want to give Kristen next opportunity to share, but I also want Corie to share later about how different generations approach these different moments. Because, I can't believe that like we're not the first. You're not the first, Heather. I'm not the first to have experienced this like compounded experience. And so, but how we interpret it and how we vocalize it, changes as she is researched and how based on our age. And I'm not going to ask anyone, like I said earlier in the call, I'm not going to ask anyone to like age themselves to say like what generations they're from, but that is what I'll let Corie describe those later. But Kristen, would you like to share? And then Corie, I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the opportunity. So one of the things that I noticed Heather saying, and I think that all of us could probably relate to in some capacity, is that when we're moving around like this all the time, it's basically that whole idea of everything and everyone comes first. And I think that that is a very slippery slope, and it really puts us on the back burner. I think that's something that just leads to burnout. And I'm really curious about how burnout relates to that kind of phenomenon among military spouses. I think it's probably not studied enough. I have read a little bit of research on it, but that's something that I'm very interested in. But then what brought me here today was really the idea of the pressure to be resilient. I personally have never had anyone tell me like, oh, you have to be resilient. This is what you have to do, from any formal or informal source. I think it's more, it's a sink or swim atmosphere, and you just have to learn to basically figure it out. And I think one of the biggest tools in that, or some of the biggest tools, are self-care and then expectation management. And I think that's one thing that I've really come to be okay with as a more experienced spouse. I've been a spouse for 17 years. We've been through 12 deployments. But I think that communication and expectation management is a huge key in being able to be resilient too. yeah, I lost my train of thought, but those are my basic things. I don't think it's coming from anyone specifically on my end. It's just really you have to, or you're going to drown. And I think that's kind of an unfortunate thing. And there are resources out there to help, but sometimes when you just have too many things on your plate, it's hard to even be able to access or research or, afford those resources sometimes.
Thank you for sharing. Corie, would you mind addressing some of those things? I'm sure have a lot of thoughts.
I have so many thoughts, and that same thing happened earlier today. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more succinct. First of all, thank you guys so much for what you're sharing and the vulnerability of what you're sharing as well. From a generational perspective, what I think is very interesting is that those, maybe let's say older millennials, Gen X and Boomer, who've just gone through the 2 decades of global conflict, that's where, like Jeremy's point of just kind of hearing that resiliency all the time, still today, funding for resources or programs or even training for families and spouses is those words resilience and in the language, so that if you want to pay for training or if you need money for training and programming, it has to be directly tied to resilience and readiness. And so from a policy perspective, we're really thankful that the DoD cares about us being ready and resilient. But when so much of that trickles down in messaging to helping you be resilient, again, a positive thing for us to learn how to be resilient and to implement these. I wonder if generationally, for those of us who not only heard it from the DoD in their campaigning and in their messaging towards the community, but also as senior spouses and senior leaders were using that word very heavily for a very long time. I think it's very possible that things are starting to shift where the senior spouse community or those Gen X and older millennials who are really feeling burned out by that word and are maybe really feeling like it pushed us way too far. It didn't give us a chance to rest, like whatever those reasons are, especially as Heather was just describing a second ago, that I think we're beginning to see fewer, especially spouses, use resilience because they themselves have a reaction to it. And so then that kind of comes up with the question is, well, what do we use instead of resilient, and what should the expectation be? And that's where I actually see the generations really struggling. And I think it's creating a lot of conflict, but potential change, and that can be good or bad in the community, is that as we are learning to do something different, it is scary to do something different. It's scary to look in the mirror, as again, Heather was just being so vulnerable there a second ago, to look in the mirror and go, what if I didn't like that? Like, what if that wasn't a good decision? Or what if that was too much? We just had this question of how do you know when you reach your limits? And I think that's a very important question, that when any of us go through a season that is particularly unrelenting, right? Whether it's what Heather just described in the military community, or whether you or you see someone else go through like a ton of medical scares, or like back to back, just, when you look at a family, you're like, oh my goodness, when is it going to stop for them? Like, surely they're going to break at some point if it doesn't stop, right? That we all have within us built this need for control, but also need for a break, right? Need for a space or a season where we can recover. And so when we find that we can hit a limit, and identify that limit, or when we are experiencing life that is so stressful and we go, wow, something has to stop, what comes up in us is the desire to set a boundary, right? Sometimes if it's in a relationship, we go, hey, wait a minute, time out. This is too much. I'm going to ask you to stop or change your expectations of me. Or if it's with life, we find other ways to control and set boundaries. To Kristen's point, we go, all right, time out. I'm going to set some boundaries here and do some self-care because I can't do anymore. I need to pause and look at how do I recover, right? So I think there's a natural thing built inside of us that hits our limits and needs to recover. And so if recovery is never part of the conversation, that's concerning, right? If it's not, if we don't have resiliency with an expectation of resiliency and the healthiness of resiliency as part of the conversation, and it's not paired with recovery, then perhaps there's been an ongoing generational message by the institution, but also that we feed and continue, that I guess we're just supposed to continue to be resilient and just suck it up. And I have spouses that have said to me that they literally believed and said out loud, they were using the metaphor of cooking dinner, and that they literally said, it's okay for us to be put on the back. They literally said to be put on the back burner. We're the peas. The peas go in that one saucepan, and we're on the back burner, while the chicken, which is the main dish, is on the front burner, where it's going to get a lot of attention because we don't want to ruin the chicken, but we're going to get to those peas. And I was like, I don't like that metaphor. I think that sounds terrible. Number one, I don't want to be peas. Every now and then I would like to be chicken. You know what I mean? And like, I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of that. But I think recovery needs to be an important part of teaching resiliency. And when it's not offered, even from that, it raises a much higher, more difficult question when you're looking at the institution. And it makes you want to look back and go, well, what do you believe about recovery? What does the institution, what does the nation believe about recovery from war? Is there such a thing? So it opens up a big can of worms.
Thank you so much for sharing. And one thing that I have found interesting is that the all volunteer force is still young. Like, I mean, in the grand scheme of an institution of how, but in the, I guess, 50 years or so since the all volunteer force started, the population within this nation has radically changed. But at the same time, going back to the expectation, I have a book that was like a literature review from 82, and it talks about how an Army study showed that although only a small percentage of officers' wives, they say, were employed, of those who did work, most worked because of financial necessity. So it's like it's always been a financial necessity for two incomes to be the standard. And so if this is something that was a literature review in 82, that tells me that not much progress has been made over the time that we've been an all volunteer force. And I think that goes back to what you're saying, Corie, of if we have the expectation where we need to be resilient, we have an expectation too that some of the things we're being asked to do will be genuinely addressed. And perhaps it's more, in the earlier conversation, it came up like, well, okay, does that look like fixing the problem, or does that look like communicating that there may not be a fix to the problem? Because that might be the reality too. We have to acknowledge that.
Or can I throw in a third option?
Sure.
The third option can be, if I can't fix the problem, or if there is no solution, what does it look like as a community or as an individual, at least, to set healthy boundaries with the community, with the institution, or with the expectation? And that is where I think the community might be at, of what does it mean if we naturally feel a sense of setting boundaries? What does it actually look like for a culture to set those boundaries if they're not given the opportunity or given the permission to recover? Does you see what I'm saying?
I think that is interesting, because that usually when a boundary is set, there is a consequence if it's violated, right? And so is that retention, recruitment, is that the consequence of not, and I'm not asking anyone to respond, but I think that's just part of that, the implication of that. And Kristen, I see you're raising your finger.
I would love for someone else to answer that question.
Yeah, feel free. I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on this, please.
I don't have any profound thoughts, but I remembered my thought from earlier when you said that. I had it highlighted under here too, but resilience has a cost. And so that was something that just like touched on that for sure.
Yeah. Who do you think? So
what is that cost?
Yeah. Who pays the cost? Who is the one paying it? Is it always the family? Is it shared? Is it a shared burden?
I think it depends on the situations and the level of support. So sometimes I think it's the family. Sometimes I think it's the service member. Sometimes I think it's everyone, service member and family, but maybe even for different reasons.
Anyone else have any thoughts?
I think that, I agree with Kristen. It depends, and the situations are different. And it absolutely is dependent on your home situation. I happen to have an amazing partner who is the better half of Team Campbell. And the only reason I endure any of this is because life with him is worth it, even though I kind of hate what his job makes us do a lot of the time. Like, he's worth it. And I remind him all the time, like, hey, we're going to have a couple decades of this. It's not going to involve military life. So that's what I'm hanging in for, right? But it feels like it's often the spouses and the families who have to pay the price, who have to be resilient, right? But really, we're just expected to sacrifice. We're expected to work for free. We're expected to be, positive Polly and stay at home and run the house. And that doesn't work when we know that 67% of Americans agree that we need two incomes to be comfortable. And, we have a Department of Defense that runs missions and training and runs our military as if somebody is at home handling things, the dog, the house, the kids, the car, someone's handling it, but pays military families as if they are every other family that has a second income. And I think we're really to this breaking point in our community. We have to decide, are we a one working parent and one at home parent institution, or are we a dual working institution? And if we are a dual working institution, we have to change the way that we're working our service members. We have to change the way that we're supporting our families, but we cannot continue to work them like someone's at home and pay them like someone else is working. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of this stress, is that we do have spouses who are trying to work. We have families that need special care. It's a lot more complex than it was 50 years ago when we set up this model of wives following people around the country. We weren't expected to work in anything other than being teachers or nurses anyway. And now we have these amazing, dedicated, educated men and women who want to not only do the thing that they love, but do it for their community, oftentimes within the community that they're living in, their local community, their military community. And we want to feel seen and supported by our local community and seen and supported by our military community. And we're overlooked by the local community often, and we're pushed aside by the military community. And I know for me and a lot of my peers, we often have this feeling of like, who's coming for us? Like, who's giving us respite? Who's giving us a recovery time? Like, my spouse is gone. He can't do it. We don't live near family. They can't do it. Like, who's coming for us? And I think that's sort of an underlying theme that I see in a lot of conversations with peers, is like, oh, it's just on us all the time. Or I can give someone else a break, but now I'm taking on their workload so that they can get a break, hoping they'll reciprocate it, right?
It's hard to ask someone who's drowning to help you not drown. Sorry, Corie, go for it.
Yes, sorry, Jennifer. I was just going to say, well, that brings us back to the consequences and the cost. And so I would love to just throw that question out again, because I think it's very hard to answer. So if that is true, where does that go? Like, what's the consequence of that messaging continuing, whether it's the institution or whether we do it to ourselves? Maybe a little mixture of both sometimes, but where does that, in Gen X language, we used to say, play the tape all the way out, like play the story all the way out, right? So if you play that all the way out, what are the third, fourth order of effects that happen, the consequences of everybody starting to go, this is too much, or in response to what you just said?
Corie, I'm going to try to answer that question a little bit. I think there's a cost to service, and it's not well measured. That's the key to all of this. And I made a comment today on LinkedIn about the junior enlisted pay raise is one example, right? And there's an upcoming quadrennial military compensation review that's ongoing, et cetera. And to your point, Heather, I think affirmation's part of that. That's not calculated, not well, at least. I also don't think that quadrennial compensation model does a very good job of understanding what it really takes and what that cost of service is. They just compare, or DoD just compares, our service members' salary and all the benefits to, the average civilian in the workforce, and that's not sufficient. I don't have a great answer for that, but I think whatever that looks like, whatever algorithm that's created, and I think one should be, to more effectively calculate that cost of service. I think the end result to your question, Corie, is that you're going to see further retention and recruitment problems with we kind of had parts of this conversation this weekend, eventually leading to, a draft or some version of that, right? And that's maybe not the path we want. There's pluses and minuses to that as well. But I think everyone needs to have eyes wide open as to what might be coming down the pike.
I appreciate what you're sharing, Jeremy, and it reminds me of the conversations that happen over unpaid labor just in general, like household labor, division of household duties. Those conversations are not happening in a good way on the civilian side. So this isn't to let the military off the hook, but you see the makeup of who's on this call right now. There's a lot of women who, and to Heather's point, and this is my soapbox, of course, so I'll just shut up after I say this, but it's the idea of the things that go unseen and the costs that are unseen. We're not good at quantifying those household costs across the board, not just the military, but we can look to the civilian world and say, okay, in other greedy jobs that are greedy, like being a lawyer, being in a med school, those types of greedy jobs often end up with a very high salary. And there's a reason they get through that hard time to then get to something cushier. I don't see that same greed compensating, to Heather's point, in the military. And I think that is where this is headed, because I think the conversation often goes to well, this isn't, what are we, like a welfare state? Are we just going to keep offering family programming and try to put band-aids on the problem? Anyway, I want to make sure we get back to the resilience specifically in the messages that we're hearing. Does anyone have anything to add to what we've just shared before we kind of maybe look at some of these, a different line of questioning? Because I think that where we're at is really interesting, and I want to hear if anyone else has any thoughts.
I would love to just add one really quick thing, Jennifer, maybe just some data to throw. I thought about this in our last call, and I was like, I just kind of had this epiphany, and I had to call my husband afterwards, and I'm like, so in the book, I talk about in 2021, I gave as many people as I could the Holmes Ray inventory that measures stress. And this was 21 after recovering from COVID. And thankfully I had another clinician that had also been using that same inventory and doing it a lot with the SOF community. And so we combined our results together. And it's this all things can't be measured by the Holmes, right? But it's just an assessment meant for you to look at major big life events and how many big life events have you gone through in the last 6 months. And then you're supposed to tally it up. And then based off of those numbers, you come up with this total number. And then you see how likely are you to have a health breakdown based off of that sheer amount of stress that you've just been through. And so it was the results are if you get between, I think 150 and 300, you have a 50% chance of having a medical health breakdown within 2 years. And if you go above 300, you have an 80% chance of a health breakdown medically within 2 years. And when I tallied all of the results, 85.4% of all the results were 50 to 80% chance of a health breakdown in 2 years. And a huge number, actually it was a huge number to me. 6% of those, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a lot. 6% reach numbers into the thousands. Okay. The inventory doesn't even go that high. It goes to 500, right? And so I had this thought today, Jennifer, 2 years from 2021 is about now. And it occurred to me, what is happening from a health perspective in our community? That is something that I would like to research somehow. I know from a service member perspective, we are seeing a lot of health issues and back issues and strange medical issues that can only be explained by the detox and the release of stress hormones in their bodies. And you have old trauma and stress that's coming up in their bodies where they're just now starting to deal with it. We tend to see that when they transition out of the military and there's less to be stressed about. It's kind of like after a deployment when everybody gets sick and we call it the deployment crud, right? You've been stressed and carrying all these stress hormones and then it dumps in your body and we get sick. And now that the Afghanistan exit happened and there's lower stress in some areas, we're seeing service members have these strange medical issues. At least I'm seeing that. And I wonder if it's happening in the spouse community as well. So that's something I'm going to be going and looking at and talking with people about is I want to know who is getting ill medically. And are we seeing spikes in, we already have an issue with shortage of providers, but I'm wondering if it's also being met with a surge in medical need. So maybe not something we can talk about, but I will say that's something that hit me earlier today that I'm going to look into.
I have a follow-up question on that. And then Kristen, oh, I'm so sorry. So my follow-up question on that is, first of all, there was a question about the type of survey. That was one thing. If you don't mind putting that in the chat, Corie. The other question I had is, if that survey predicted that it would happen around 2 years, what happens when you hold on to it for longer than that? Like if you're going beyond that predicted timeline, the VA often says, we don't want people to keep talking about the broken veterans. And I'm like, well, we're talking about messages here, right? Like the broken veteran is a narrative that isn't great. It's not great for anyone. We don't want the broken veteran, period. But how do we prevent that breakdown? Well,
yeah, I would say anytime we hold on to that amount of stress, and that's why in that chapter I called it a cultural breakdown, because after COVID, we were already heading there with holding on to it for so long. So we were already getting ill. And so it's going to leak out a little bit through mental health, through medical issues. It's not good to have that much stress in your body. It affects your cortisol, which affects your other hormones. For women, that can look like irritability, weight gain, an inability to handle stress well, which, we talk about reactions and impulsivity. For men, we see that lower testosterone. And we're also seeing that when those hormones are affected between cortisol and testosterone, or you could say adrenal fatigue is another way to say what this looks like. But we see for men with testosterone, it can almost mimic PTSD symptoms. So some of the things that you would see in a PTSD diagnosis can sometimes be adrenal fatigue or some of those shifts in because all of your hormones are connected. So again, so we can see it now as people are starting to get ill, but then after they retire or after they slow down, then they are getting ill even more. And I actually, in my sessions with people that are transitioning, I encourage them to take 6 months to a year. And if you can financially not go straight into another job, give your body a chance to recover before, because I'm seeing other people go straight into jobs. And then not only are they getting ill, but it's compounding into major illnesses like heart issues, diabetes, and some of those other ones where it compounds into something more severe than it needs to be. But I'll put the scale in the chat.
thank you. Kristen?
So it's really, we're talking about like the whole allostatic load, which is the cumulative effects of chronic stress and life events on mental and physical health. And I think that's something that's really being missed among leaders for both service members and for our families. We're not taking into account this, like what's happening down the road, the after effects, and it's leading to all these different things. And ironically, I was recently diagnosed with adrenal fatigue, like probably 4 months ago. The exhaustion was like through the roof, could not make it through the day. My levels were so out of whack. And then the hard thing about adrenal fatigue is like a lot of, traditional Western medicine doesn't actually recognize adrenal fatigue as a real issue. So that really complicates like getting help and getting treatment. I had gone to my primary care provider for a few things and she just was like, oh yeah, you're fine. No problem. You're just stressed. You need to work on your lifestyle. Well, I mean, easy for you to say. I'm solo parenting. We moved 3 times in 3 years, all these things. And so luckily I found someone who is helping me through that. I feel much better. I've still got work to do, but the cost of that is I'm having to pay out of pocket for all of this to get the guidance because it's through a more integrative, holistic, naturopathic approach.
I appreciate you sharing and your vulnerability. I think there was a question for you in the chat, just in case you didn't get to see it, about the spelling of the words you used. Want to make sure everyone gets a chance to share, because there's a lot of different topics. I would love to hear what a better way to approach this conversation might be for leaders. So if you were going to share your experiences, is it going well for you? Is that word, the way that it's used in some contexts, working well, but in others it's not? Like if you're going to meet up with someone like Corie and in a session, it would actually be a wonderful lesson and skill you've learned, or, you know, as you mentioned, going to a training and receiving that training. Is there a time that maybe is not working well, and what would you suggest would be a better approach? Or don't answer that, answer whatever you want. We've talked about a lot. So anyone who wants to share, floor is yours.
I'll jump in real fast and just say that I think leaders, generally speaking, we can all learn, right? We can all resilience training in of itself may not be bad. Any of this type of training may be good for us, but I think leaders need to make sure that the environment that we're living in isn't the actual problem, as opposed to using resilience as I hate to say this word, but cop out for a reason not to fix the environment that we and our service members are living in.
Anyone else have anything?
But, you know, I think thinking about these trainings, right? We have trainings for resilience. We have trainings of how to deal with these life circumstances that we have, right? So I think of being a woman, I'm trained all, you know, since I was 15, since I was 16, since I could drive by myself, I'm trained on how to get myself into a safe environment, how to make sure I can get out of an unsafe environment, how to advocate for myself, how to avoid sexual harassment, how to report it when it happens, how to deal with sexual assault, all of these things, right? So is training me to deal with the after effects of the culture I live in, is that adequate? Or should we actually like maybe train other people to not create these situations, right? So I feel like that's kind of what we get with resilience training. Is like, well, we've trained you how to be resilient. We've trained you how to cope with it. We're not going to actually change anything that we expect of you. We're not going to change the load, and we're definitely not going to help you. But we are going to give you this really wonderful computer-based training, and you can click through it. And when you get to the end, there's gonna be a little certificate that you've like completed a 45-minute CBT on how to be resilient. And then next year you can come back and renew it, and you can take your CBT every year. Like, is that what we're doing? Obviously, that's an oversimplification of it, right? But like, is that what we're doing, is just training people to be resilient and not actually trying to give them time to recover, to give them tools and resources other than what they can control within their own body, which sometimes we see that we can't, or you don't get that opportunity for those stress load, you know, the stress hormones to go down. As the pandemic slowed down and people went back to real life, I moved to Fairbanks, Alaska, and I lived in Timbuktu and virtual world for 2 more years under the worst command environment we have ever been in. Lots of retaliation. Every bit of advocacy I did was direct retaliation against my husband. Like, those things are really, really hard, right? And then we moved into the last 15 months, which have been chaos. So I'm on like year 4 of that, like high stress. Each year is kind of different. Why? But one, I don't know how my stress relief will go, because I've already had heart surgery a couple of years ago. But like, what does that look like? You know, do we just keep training people, or do we actually try to improve some of the problem?
So, to answer your question, there is actual like documentation. So I put in a book. There's a book called Military Welfare State, and it goes into the actual strategic decision to reduce programming and increase messaging around resiliency. And I mean, and to help use that idea to inform the programs that do exist. I think that, as we mentioned before, there is not a malicious intent. I think that it just isn't playing out in the intended way. And as we may or may not know, if we're not reflecting back on how it's working, it may not ever change unless someone advocates for it to change, which is not necessarily the best model. But I know a lot of people on this call do just that, and advocate for programs to change. So I think that, to your point, Heather, I think that, and it inspired a question I put in the poll that I'd love to hear from folks. If the DoD was to respond to do something that would require less resilience from you, or the thing that keeps like coming back up that really puts a strain on your ability to rise to the occasion. What was it? Bounce back, Corie? Is that the phrase, bouncing back? If what, is it something that can change? And that goes back to Corie's statements about boundaries. And is it something, and then the consequences of those boundaries? It's a really interesting conversation. And I know we're only a few minutes out. Did anyone not get to share?
I think Teresa has tried several times.
Yes, go for it. Yes, I know. Like, Teresa, you're so polite. I keep seeing your face saying something, but I'm like, I don't want to call you out, but go for it. I'd love to hear from you.
Also that I don't know where my unmute button is. So I'm like grabbing a mouse for work computer and then realizing, oh, that's the wrong computer. So what I was going to say was earlier, what sparked my interest about this particular session is that I called my company's EAP to ask for some resources. And the person I was speaking to said, she picked up that I was a military spouse. And she said, oh, but you're so resilient. And it was kind of like, I'm not supposed to ask for help. That was not what she meant, but that is how I took that. And I was kind of like, I mean, yes, I want to be resilient, but I also need help sometimes. So when I saw this session, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so like in line with that experience I just had with this resilient. You're so resilient. And I was like, I'm broken. I feel broken. That's why I'm calling you. So anyways, that's kind of, I feel like sometimes the word resiliency is tossed around as, and unfortunately it's almost like a cop out of, but you're resilient, so it's okay. We got you the training. It's okay. And the training is great. I still talk about icebergs and all that kind of stuff, but I still struggle. So it's not a fix-all to say you're resilient.
So maybe, and what I'm hearing in that, and some other folks have shared, is, the use of the word resilience isn't the thing that makes people go gag or like, don't use that word. It's more of the follow-up. Is there a follow-up? Is there a reciprocation of that expectation? We expect you to be resilient, and we have some expectation of the institution. Whether, to Corie's point, we have to set realistic expectations of the institution. But at the same time, in this conversation, these conversations are meant to be had publicly, so the DoD has insight into what we're feeling and thinking about how, and it informs what they're doing, I would hope. And so, and to Corie's earlier, I guess, point, and maybe this happened in this conversation or the other one, so please, like, forgive me if it happened in the first call, but she was saying, there are things coming down the pike, where there are implications of this word and the use of this word, or people who maybe have reached the end for themselves and are willing to say so. In Corie's book, she really does a great job of talking about how different generations embrace strength. And I love that, you mentioned in the chat, asking for help is a strength. I perceive that to be true, but I think that in her book, she kind of does highlight that that's not how every generation sees it, and not how leaders see it because of the generations that they are in. And so I want to give Corie the last word, but we can stay on. I can stay on for a short bit after to continue the conversation, but I want to be respectful of everyone's evening because I know it's late on the East Coast. So Corie, would you like to have any final thoughts or any thoughts?
First, thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for your kind words. Honestly, thank you guys for giving your time tonight and for being so vulnerable and challenging such a very difficult topic and conversation and being honest about it. I think saying the hard things out loud is what leads to healing. And I also know the highest level of healing that I find is when we can overcome some things and then go on to help others heal, right? However, I think I want to respond maybe in closing to what Teresa just brought up, and that is suffering is subjective. I know there's a good friend of mine who is an EFMP family. Both kids struggle with a lot of complex issues, and her husband is also has a severe TBI. And there's been so many times that I've wanted to go to her as a friend and complain about my day. And there's been several times where I've like stopped myself and said, well, I can't talk about what I'm going through because I don't even know how she's surviving. in her house, right? But when I've told her that, she's always been so sweet to remind me that my struggle is my struggle and her struggle is her struggle, and they feel the same to us in our skin, right? And so I think it is really hard, Teresa, when you want to go ask for help. And we would say that our community is, and we as spouses are extremely gritty. Like we have the ability to figure out how to get through all of this and grow from it and be better because of it. But to your point, that doesn't mean that we don't hit our own limits and we won't need something at some point and won't need rest and recovery and assistance and support and more skills and whatever. And so I think it is scary sometimes to go ask for help, especially in the civilian community that doesn't go through the same things that we go through. And then there's other times we go to a fellow spouse or someone who's gone through something extremely difficult, and we're afraid to bring up what we're struggling with. And the truth of it is, struggle and suffering is part of life. And whether we are in the military or out of the military, we would face hardship. And in some seasons, it may feel insurmountable. Like that's just part of life. But that doesn't mean that we should have to live in that place all the time. And so when we hit a point where we can do no more, to Kristen's point, we have to figure out what we can do for ourselves. And when we are ever in a relationship that doesn't allow us to set healthy boundaries for our own sake, then we find ourselves in a situation where we've got to make healthy decisions for ourselves. And that's where I think that the younger generation is starting to consider that. What does it mean for us to make different decisions? And I think the DoD is going to be facing, to Jeremy's point, facing some hard decisions on a changing culture that is going to choose something healthy or healthier that they can come up with. And the DoD may have to react to that. And I'm not sure if the DoD has had to respond in that way before. So thank you guys for your time tonight. I will stick around a little bit after as well, but I know we want to be respectful of your time. So thank you for being here.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it. I'm going to end the recording now, but I appreciate you all being here, and you're welcome to hop off at any point, or you can stick around and continue.